founded Lyceum Communications, which is a new coaching consulting company meant not only for debaters, which is what I did before, but for entrepreneurs, businessmen, women, people who are more in the professional community. And the goal of that is to take classical rhetoric, type of Aristotelian rhetoric, and bring it into modern day public speaking, because the main area that I felt was missing through all of my coaching experience, not only teaching, but receiving coaching as well, was that kind of classical rhetoric background, especially when I joined the professional world and I was kind of learning to understand how to coach professionals with public speaking. I noticed that most people just taught public speaking as a skill, adopt these certain tactics and you've got it. When I was realizing more and more through my years of debate and then afterwards, that I realized public speaking was much more of an art and in a mindset. So if you adopt a certain mindset going into what you're going to say, you don't need the whole rules of absolutely have 3 points to every single speech. You have to have a hook. You have to have an introduction. You have to do that whole silly 3-point triangle thing that everyone talks about in every public speaking class, if any of you have taken public speaking classes before. So my whole mission with this series of events, this is just the first of all the series, is to kind of help people understand that public speaking is not only a skill that you adopt through certain techniques, but it's also an art that you can perfect through a certain mindset. So I wanted to kind of divide this into 2 different points. The first is why storytelling is so important and why I consider that to be one of the most colorful pieces of persuasion. And then also what makes the best stories? Like, how can you adopt good storytelling into your speaking? And my favorite quote about storytelling, which really captures why I think storytelling is important, is from Dale Carnegie. And he says, "The great truths of the world have often been couched in fascinating stories." And this is why I've always been so fascinated by stories, is because you could be listening to a story and get completely lost and enthralled in what is being said. And you can be engaged with what is being said and ask questions and be waiting for the end of the story, right? Because it's so engaging. And halfway through the story, you could realize that there's something hidden in this story that is revolutionary. And all along, the storyteller knows this, right? They want you to accept that truth. They want you to experience that point or to accept that certain point. And they hide it in a fascinating story so that you can kind of come to that realization on your own. So that's my main overview of why I think stories are so fascinating, is because they have an ability unlike any other skill or technique of public speaking to help people accept a certain frame of mind. So there are 4 reasons why storytelling specifically is really powerful. The first one is because it breaks down walls and it helps people to trust you just a little bit more. So for example, if you are, let's use the example of entrepreneurship, and you are trying to pitch an investor on a brand new idea. If you just stand up and start saying, here's what I have for my business, here's what I need, here's where I want to go, that's a lot of great information that your investor needs. But you're going to have to spend that whole time trying to build up a relationship and trying to get that investor to like you. Whereas if you start with a story right off the bat, and they're not really expecting that, right? They're expecting you to throw numbers at them, but you tell a story instead. It really breaks down the walls. They forget for a second that they're listening to a pitch, and they automatically put themselves in the middle of their story. And I told my debate students this all the time, is that the number one thing you need to kind of think about is that you want your judge or your audience to forget for just a second that they're listening to a debate round. Because if they can be so interested in what you're saying that they kind of forget what decision they have to make after what you're saying, that's the goal. You want them to be truly interested in what you're saying. And stories break down those walls. It kind of builds a connection with people, gets them to trust you a little bit more, and allows them to forget for just a second. And that builds a relationship between you and your audience. So the second reason why storytelling is really important, and also feel free to chime in at any point here and ask a question. It's very flexible like that. But the second reason why storytelling is so important is because it's using the power of pathos. So how many of you have heard of the three modes of persuasion from Aristotle?
I have.
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, they're pretty basic. Ethos, pathos, logos. Ethos is credibility based on someone's character in the round, building up that character and that trustworthiness that gives them the credibility to say what they're going to say. Logos is the logic that goes along with that. So make sure that whatever you're saying actually makes sense and you're making a point. But pathos, I think, is the one of those three that is most often confused. Pathos is often defined as emotion, using emotion. But if you read Aristotle's book on rhetoric, he defines it as putting your audience in the right frame of mind, right? So storytelling does that. It puts your audience in a frame of mind to accept what you're willing to say. Using pathos is also, it's important in every presentation, but I would say it's especially important when you're giving a presentation to someone that might not be on the same page as you, right? If you're going to say something that might be a little controversial or biased, you kind of want to put your audience in a frame of mind to accept what you're going to say before you actually say it. So Bryan Stevenson, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of him before. I'll send around a link afterwards to one of his talks. But he was dubbed one of the most persuasive TED Talks of all time. And on their website, they kind of divide down some of the most persuasive, powerful, inspiring TED Talks. And Bryan Stevenson was one of the most persuasive TED Talks of all time. My favorite book by Carmen Gallo, Talk Like TED, highly recommend it to anyone who wants to get better at the art of public speaking. He talks about how Bryan Stevenson, in order to, so this book is dedicated to different public speaking tips based on the best TED Talks that have ever been given. And Carmen Gallo goes into the specifics of these TED Talks, breaks down everything that each TED Talk speaker did, and kind of gives them as tips for us. And Bryan Stevenson, what he did is he broke down his word count of everything that Bryan Stevenson said, and he divided it into ethos, pathos, and logos. And he found out that 65% of his speech was pathos. He was telling stories. He was like a law enforcement officer, and he was telling stories of his childhood and his grandmother, something you would never expect to be applicable to what he was going to say. But then right at the end, he made his point after people were so connected and so inspired by his story, right? So most people are tempted to prove to their audience why, what they're saying makes a ton of sense, or they're really passionate about proving to their audience that they're credible enough to say what they are saying, when oftentimes we need to take the view off of us, right? Making sure that I'm smart enough to say this, making sure I make a whole bunch of sense, and put it onto our audience, making sure that our audience is able to accept what we're, about to say. So the third reason why storytelling is super important is because it plants ideas and emotions that last. So it's actually been scientifically proven, and this is in this book, Talk Like TED, as well, that brains are more active whenever a story is being told. So versus you're giving your audience a few points, you're showing facts, figures, you're using PowerPoint presentations, they found that the most brain activity that happens in the mind of an audience happens whenever someone is telling a story. This also means going back to the whole breaking down walls and building that trust between your audience, that they are on the same wavelength as you almost, right? Their minds are active. They are accepting what you are saying. They are being put in the same frame of mind that you are. So when you tell stories, you're planting ideas and emotions that last much longer than data and figures. So look back onto all the presentations that you've heard in the past. How many of you can remember a story told in those presentations? Remember a good story that you heard in a presentation? Yeah. How many people remember all the facts, data, evidence, or logic that went into that? Not many people do, but a lot of people, they hear the story, they remember this incredible story, and then they remember the message that goes along with that story. So I used to compete in impromptu and speech and debate where you had only 5 minutes to get a point across. And this is what I would do, right? I would tell a story that went from the beginning all the way to the end, and I wouldn't spend a whole bunch of time on facts and figures. And I would definitely include those. I don't want you to think that, pathos is the teacher's pet and gets all the love, and you should never give any attention to ethos and logos. That's not true. But pathos is the thing that kind of plants those ideas that stick. They're not going to remember the facts and figures unless they're taking notes as much as they'll remember those stories, which is the fourth reason why storytelling is a habit that everyone should adopt, and that is that they create sticky ideas. Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath is an incredible book, once again, that everyone should read if you want to become a better storyteller. And they talk about this as well, that storytelling is one of the ways to create a sticky idea. So especially I know I have at least 3 or 4 entrepreneurs in this call right now. And you've heard of the elevator pitch, right? Where you have to imagine that you have only 30 seconds the amount of time you would have like in an elevator or something. And you meet the person you want to talk to, and you have 30 seconds to tell them what you want to tell them. And you want them to remember that, right, when they leave. So are you going to list off your entire resume? Or are you going to tell them a quick story about why you're passionate about their company, or why what you're doing is in line with their mission, or something like that? You want to get those sticky ideas out first. So when they walk out of that elevator, they think of that story and they remember your name. So those are 4 things about storytelling specifically that are reasons to adopt them into your speaking. One phrase that I wrote out that I think is a good takeaway for all of these 4 reasons is that storytelling is simply data with a soul, right? It doesn't mean that you have to get rid of ethos and logos. Those are very important, but you can intertwine ethos and logos inside of pathos, right? You can tell a story while also including that data and that logic and that credibility that goes along with telling a story. All pathos does and all storytelling does is it gives that data a soul so that your audience can accept it in a better manner. There are 3 types of storytelling: personal stories, stories about other people, stories about brand success. I love the story of like Southwest Airlines. Have you guys ever heard of like how good their customer service is? And it's incredible. And that's like one thing, a good point about it being like sticky, right? Is I don't even remember the whole story. I can just remember Southwest Airlines, great customer service. And ever since I heard that story about Southwest Airlines, I haven't booked with another airline.
Yeah.
I can't even remember the entire story. And I definitely don't remember all the facts and figures of how much money their people saved. But I do remember that story proved to me that Southwest Airlines had an incredible mission, and I always wanted to book with them.
Yeah, I remember that story because it was in that book, Made to Stick.
Yes.
And they were like talking about the core central idea behind it and how they wanted to start serving like steak dinners on their flights. But then he's like, does this go along with the philosophy we had at like the beginning? And he's like, no, it doesn't. So that would compromise the whole idea, the whole structure we set up.
Exactly. Right. And it's the same thing. Like every once in a while, I have to fly a different airline because someone else is booking for me. But I set up my like rewards account and everything with Southwest Airlines because of that story. And I read that book probably a year and a half ago, and I still remember it, right? Okay, so that was a lot of me talking about why storytelling is so important. And I could go on forever and ever about that. But before we go on to what makes a good story, does anyone have any questions? Or any thoughts either? Like shouldn't just be me talking. Throw out a thought or an experience you had about a story going really well for you in a presentation.
Who's the author of the book Talk Like TED?
Carmen Gallo. It's Carmine, and then Gallo is Gallo. And it's a great book because it's divided through 9 different public speaking tips, which I will refer to in other webinars. And you can go through all of them and you don't have to read it from front to cover. I use it more like a textbook than I do like anything else. And if I ever have a client or anything that's struggling with one aspect of those skills, I'll go specifically to that section. Like, for example, I read the storytelling section over and over again every time I do one of these webinars, just to remind myself or go back and use it as a textbook. So yeah, really good. Anyone else? Okay. So making the best stories. So it's all fun and games to talk about how storytelling will absolutely revolutionize the way that you give presentations, but that doesn't do anything for you if you don't really know how to tell a good story. Something that I love about storytelling as well is that you don't have to be a great speaker to be a great storyteller. So a lot of people are afraid of public speaking, right? They say it's one of, sometimes higher than the fear of death is the fear of public speaking, because people don't think that they're very good at it. But my number one advice to people whenever they're giving talks is to tell a story and to be themselves and to not think about it as if they were giving a presentation. Just tell a story that they enjoy and then give your points right after that. And the prime example of this is, once again, another TED Talk speaker. I'm obsessed with TED Talks, Brené Brown. And she gave a TED Talk. I believe hers was on vulnerability. And it's, once again, one of the most viewed TED Talks in all of history. I almost turned off her TED Talk because the first few words out of her mouth made me think that she wasn't a great speaker, right? I was like, if I'm going to watch 20 minutes of a TED Talk, I'm going to choose some of the best communicators. I don't really want to waste my time listening to one that's not a great public speaker. But I kept it on for just like 20 more seconds, and she started telling a story, and I was so captivated by her story. And yeah, every once in a while, she would have this public speaking tick that just annoyed me, and it would catch me off guard, right? But I listened to her story, and I absolutely love it. Then she went on and she gave her points, and I was blown away by her TED Talk. And I still go back and watch her TED Talk. It's one of my favorite TED Talks. I even had, when I was coaching debate camps last year, had a friend who's one of those super introverted people and very like emotionless. And he watched the TED Talk on vulnerability and then came to our room and was like, I just watched a TED Talk on vulnerability, so can I hang out with you guys? And it's like one of my favorite summer camp stories because his being vulnerable was just like hanging out with us. Yeah, anyway, that story about that TED Talk is once again how I remember that TED Talk. But all that to say, you don't have to be a good speaker to be a good storyteller. If you just adopt a couple of skills and be excited when you're telling a story, that's great. In fact, I hate to bring up so many examples of my speech and debate years, but one of the tournaments that I won in impromptu speaking, I was telling a story about how I wore a bright red suit. And if you competed in speech and debate, you knew, look, Caitlin is laughing because she knows this bright red suit. Everyone knew this bright red suit. It was the Abbey suit. Gio even laughed because Gio even knows about the bright red suit. And it got better through the years. And then, of course, when Hillary Clinton ran for president, everyone talked about Abby Lovin in her red suit, how I was copying Hillary Clinton. Not true. She copied me. Anyway, so one of the impromptus I gave, it was talking about insecurity and like inner beauty and things like that. And I looked down at my suit, and it was this 1970s bright, shiny red, ugly 65-plus-year-old woman's suit. And I'm like, this could not be a better topic for me right now. You know, I obviously have zero insecurity about what I'm wearing. And so I get up and I almost don't even write down an outline, right? I just get up and I'm like, look at me. Look at what I'm wearing right now. And I start telling story after story after story about all the ridiculous outfits that I've worn throughout the years, all the ridiculous things that I've done throughout the years. And then I ended it by saying that I was a really happy person, right? And I looked every single person in the eyes in that room, and I asked them, what is something ridiculous that you do? What is one of your guilty pleasures? What do you do that is ridiculous that makes you happy, sort of thing? And I had the time of my life in that impromptu. In fact, I was out of breath when I walked out of my competition room because I had been walking back and forth so much telling this story because my red suit was something that I was extremely passionate about. And it was me, right? It was truly me, and I was letting that come out. So the first point in being a good storyteller is that you're not trying to convince anyone of anything. You're just trying to be yourself. And something I told myself at nationals, it was the most nerve-wracked I've ever been trying to give a speech because I had never made it past quarterfinals in speech at nationals before. And I was in quarterfinals and I kept on breaking past quarterfinals, right? And I was so nervous. I've never been so nervous giving a speech. After 7 years of experience, I had never been this nervous. And so every time I would go into my room, I would look at, they had our names listed on the side of the door, and I looked at my name and I said, that's me. No one can give a speech like I can give this speech. Not that I was going to give it better than everyone else, but it's true. No one can give a speech like you can give a speech. And, there's a quote by like someone that I always, like literally this always happens in all of my webinars is I like want to quote this quote and I never have it written down, but it pretty much says like, don't try to be anyone else because everyone else is taken, right? Don't try to adopt anyone else's techniques. And this is especially important in storytelling. Have any of y'all ever seen like a president give a speech, or Caitlin, you would know this, a debater give a speech and they seem so canned? It's like, we call it debater speak in debate, or president speak. You know, they just have like a certain way that they talk because they are so, obsessed with trying to be a certain thing. Don't do that in storytelling. Absolutely not. You want to adopt yourself and internalize that you are going to give the speech that no one else can give. And that is one of the best ways to give a powerful story is if you just be yourself through it all. So that's the main takeaway. I want you to remember that. And I used a story to articulate it, right? So remember the red suit and think, be myself. That doesn't mean you have to wear a red suit. I know you want to, Anthony, but it doesn't mean you have to wear a red suit. But be yourself. The second one is to make it concrete and relatable. These are kind of two separate points, but both very important. Concrete is make someone experience the story along with you, right? So explain things. If you took a sip of water in a story that you told, explain that, right? Explain the chill that it felt when you were drinking the water. Explain everything about it, right? Like, for example, I had a friend at work, one of my colleagues, and we do public speaking trainings over lunch. And she told a story of when she went hiking, and I felt like I was right there with her because she was talking about how it was so cold that her nose was dripping, but then she was wearing mittens, and so she couldn't wipe her nose. Like all of this stuff that we all relate to, right? Whenever it's freezing cold outside and our nose starts running because it's so cold. And I loved that because I have never been on the top. I can't remember which mountain she was in, but she was in some foreign country and it was really awesome. And I've never been hiking in a situation like that, but I felt like I was right there with her because she was explaining things that I've experienced in similar situations. So you want to make it concrete so that people can relate to what you're saying. You want your audience to almost feel like they were there with you whenever you're telling the story. Which
I actually have a question for that one.
Yeah.
So I have tried and attempted to do the same thing when I was on my speech team in my high school, where I would try and explain something in further detail to keep them along with the story and to experience it along with you. But at some points, I feel like I've lost them. It's almost like when you're reading a book and someone's describing a crack in a window pane for 5 pages and you just want it to end. How do you more effectively explain things in further detail but keep them experiencing in the same story?
Sure. That's actually the 4th point to storytelling. So you got it. You know it better than I do. But you want it to be concrete, but also concise, right? So the way that I do it is it doesn't take 4 pages. You don't have to be like Hemingway in order to get people to feel like what it felt to be there.
That's actually the book I was referencing.
Okay.
A Hemingway book.
Right. Yeah. Because I've read, Hemingway is like that, right? You kind of like want to skip through it because you're like, okay, I get it.
Spark Notes.
You're on a boat, right? Like, I get it. Hemingway is a great author. Anyway. But you want to be concise whenever you're doing that, right? So the way that I do it is sometimes I just give it 1 sentence or something, or maybe 2 if I feel like it needs to be clarified. But if you use the right wording, it doesn't need more than 1 or 2 sentences. So maybe that means writing it out beforehand. If there's a certain part in a story that you want people to feel extra, like more of, then maybe write that out and use specific words that you know are going to provoke a certain feeling in your audience. I'm just going to skip to that 4th point so that we can address the being concise thing. But part of it is keeping your eye on the prize, right? Hemingway's writing, he wants people to kind of get so engulfed in what he was saying, right? That's his goal. But whenever you are giving a presentation, your goal isn't to have people get so lost in a story. You don't want them to get lost in a story. You want them to feel the story and have that connect to your mission or your goal. So keep your eye on the prize. If your prize is on that story, then by all means, stay on the story all you want. But the story should never be your prize. The story, the goal or the thesis that the story is trying to communicate should be your prize. So keep your eye on that prize. And if you can kind of feel it, you're telling a story and you're like, okay, have I communicated my thesis through the story? Then maybe move on if you kind of feel like you're talking a little bit too much, because rabbit trails are absolutely no fun. No one really likes them in a speech, especially when it's like a 10-minute presentation and you're just sitting there in the audience thinking, come on, please move on. So keep that in mind as well. I always explain public speaking as a selfless act, right? Which means whenever you're talking, it's not for your benefit. It's for your audience's benefit. You want your audience to accept an idea because you're excited about that idea. And maybe if it's in a competition, you want to win, and that's one goal, of course. But if you're truly wanting to be a good communicator, then your audience always comes first. Communication is a selfless act. So keep that in mind whenever you're telling a story. Read your audience. If your audience is getting bored, move on. Just cut it out. Unless drawing out the story builds it up, cut it out. So being concrete doesn't necessarily mean being Hemingway, right? Where you use 3 or 4 pages or 1 or 2 minutes explaining something. But it does mean that you want to use certain words that relate it to someone else. So I think this girl, my colleague, Anne, had 5 minutes to tell her story, and it was like 10 seconds that she was able to communicate to me how cold it was up there. Just talking about the way that her bones felt and the way that her nose ran, you know, just little things like that will help you be concise and concrete, and then just move on after that, which is actually plays really well into the last point about making good stories. And that is, remember exactly what it felt like. So my favorite story to tell is the story about when I won nationals for the second time in impromptu. And the reason why I like to tell that story is because I can still remember what it felt like, right? It was probably the proudest moment of my life up until now. Hopefully there'll be some bigger points in my life, you know, than winning a high school competition. And there already have been, but that was like, you know, I was standing in front of 1,000 people. There were 8 other people up on stage with me. And every single second, you were just hoping that your name was not called, right? Because you wanted to be first. And so they would call a name and you would wait and you would hope that the next name wasn't yours. And you would be looking at the people who were up on stage with you, right? These were my friends. I've seen them speak before. And so I know how good they are. And I remember the feeling of hearing Emmy Otsky's name. And you guys don't know Emmy Otsky, but she is a short girl who is the best speaker and one of the best high school communicators I've ever met. And when they called her name and I was still standing there, my stomach dropped. And you could probably see it on my face, because that was the moment I realized, oh my gosh, like I could get this. If I beat Emmy Otsky, maybe I've got this. So I feel it, right? It was one of the most intense buildups of my life, and I can tell that story better than any story I've ever told before. In fact, I've been told that whenever I tell this story to non-speech and debaters, I've been able to give them chills with them having absolutely no experience of what winning a speech tournament is like. And the reason why that's the case is because I get chills whenever I tell that story, right? I take 10 seconds or less to just close my eyes and remember the moment, and then I tell it. And if I am telling it as if I was there, right, and if I remember every single feeling that I felt when that was happening to me, my audience is going to feel it as well. So remember what it felt like. If you were excited, get excited. That's why whenever I talked about my red suit, right, I would start pacing back and forth and I would use big hand motions and I got really excited. If it's a more sad story, then remember what that felt like, because you don't want to come across as insincere. And this applies again to my final round at nationals, right? My final round was the most difficult round I've ever had, because I got my topic and I was like, oh, dang, this is going to be a rough one because it applies to a sad story in my life. And I knew that as a good communicator, I was going to have to tell that story and be authentic about it as well, right? So I internalized this. I remembered what it felt like to go through that time in my life, and I told it. And you can go back and watch the video, but there's one point that I almost lose it because I'm about to cry, because I remembered exactly what it felt like, right? And I never encourage people to cry in speeches. A lot of people will purposely cry will purposely cry just to, provoke that extra emotion. But you want to remember what it felt like, right? And if that brings you to tears, then don't be uncomfortable with that. Going back to the whole idea that communication is a selfless act. You don't want to be embarrassed by shedding a few tears or even flat out laughing out loud in a speech because something you said made you laugh, right? You want to be truly you, because that's what communicates it best to an audience. And when I first started communication, I was so canned. I was so afraid to show my true self. And you hear this from audience members too. They've come up to me afterwards and they're like, I wasn't sure if I was like, I thought what you said was really funny, but I wasn't sure if I was allowed to laugh, You don't want that to be the environment in any speech that you're giving. You want to be yourself. And so let go of that, self-consciousness, that insecurity. Be vulnerable in front of your audience. It'll build up some trust with your audience. They'll think, wow, if she can cry, or if she can really laugh at herself, or if she can make a joke about when she just slipped up right there, like this girl is the real thing. And they'll connect to you a little bit more, because I think also audiences are really intimidated by a public speaker because they think, oh man, I could never do that. But if they see a little bit of human in you when you're telling that story and you mess up, or if you laugh because it's a funny part in the story, or if you cry because it's a sad part, they're going to see that, and they're going to relate to you more. So remember what it felt like and portray that no matter what. Be careful though, because if you tell a story that's really sad, you don't want everyone to go away just like crying for the rest of the day. So, do it to some degree. Don't go completely crazy, because I'll be honest with you, after that speech I gave, I was able to hold it back in the speech, but I cried for like a whole 5 minutes after the speech, right? And it was good, but I was able to portray it in my speech without completely losing it. Yes, be alive when you speak. Don't be a robot. I've written and read so many blog posts about how you don't want to be a robot whenever you speak, and that's so true. Be alive when you speak. I've never heard it said that way, Anthony, so thank you. I'm going to use that. Okay, so those are the main points, right? Storytelling is important. It breaks down walls. You use pathos. You plant ideas and emotions that last more than data or logic, and it sticks. To tell a good story, you're not trying to convince anyone of anything. You're just trying to be yourself. You want to be concrete and relatable and concise. And most importantly, you want to remember what it felt like and portray that.